The sort of framework I'm going to illustrate for you is an evolution of environmentalism that is termed eco-modernism, and that's a school of thought that I probably now lie closer to than environmentalism per se. So I want to talk about how plentiful clean energy unlocks human potential, because it certainly does. We're actually going to start in Sydney with this woman, Estelle Wooden, the daughter of Major General Sir George Frederick Wooden. You'll find his portrait in the National Gallery. Douglas MacArthur lauded Wooden as Australia's finest soldier. Wooden accepted surrender of the Japanese after World War II. And so Estelle was part of that post-war generation. One thing that I loved about her is that she said, my father, the late Major General Sir George Wooden, was responsible for turning back the Japanese in New Guinea. But I've always felt there's no good in letting old enemies linger. And the greatest way of understanding people is speaking their language. So I started Japanese. So she's a fairly modern woman. Challenges in our community, our society and our world demand that we learn to speak each other's language. And so finding common ground and common values is a good idea, and learning to speak each other's language is a good idea. But what was particularly cool about Estelle is that she learnt Japanese after having 15 children. She was a trier. She was a worker. They also fostered children in their backyard, and they had families, men who couldn't find work and were homeless after the war. They were a very charitable, giving Catholic family. I have a connection with Estelle. She's my grandmother. Top centre is my mum, Mary, who's back in Adelaide right now looking after my kids. So I've, come down from a great-grand family of 15 children. I was one of 5 children, and I have 2 children myself, which is pretty similar to what's been happening worldwide. Population globally continues to grow. However, crucially important to understand, the rate of population growth peaked before I was born. Globally, the rate of population growth peaked before I was born and has been in strong decline ever since. And you can see that there is an outlying region where the rate of population growth remains elevated, and that is in the sub-Saharan African region at the moment. And so as an environmentalist, we pay a lot of attention to human population. We go, how are we going to deal with so many numbers? And yet to a substantial extent, the population bomb has already been diffused and it's now petering out. And so we can now anticipate moving ahead to a world where nearly everybody is having 2 children. So that's pretty much what's happening at the moment. So there's me and my daughter Abby out for a walk, and here we have a family in Bangladesh. The average number of children per family in Bangladesh these days is about 2.1. It happens really quickly. Okay, as soon as opportunity is introduced, particularly as soon as economic opportunity is introduced for women, the opportunity cost of having more children becomes very high. The benefits of having fewer children becomes very high. The availability of healthcare, vaccination, means that children are less likely to die, so you're not hedging your pets a little bit by having more children. So we're back to having about 2 children per family, and the truth is, before human population growth exploded, a lot of women would have 5 or 6 live births in pre-state societies, of whom 2 would grow to reproduce. So pre-state societies, Hans Rosling says, were not living in harmony with nature.
Child survival drives everything. 2 parents, 6 children. But that looks as a very fast population growth. 1, 2, 3, 4 of the children died before growing up to become parents themselves. People in the past never lived in ecological balance with nature. They died in ecological balance with nature. It was utterly tragic.
They were dying in harmony with nature. Okay, and now we are learning to live in harmony with nature. It takes time to change, but it does change. It probably doesn't surprise you to know that Germany is underneath the global average, but it might surprise you to know that India is also now underneath the global average, as is Bangladesh, Brazil, and China. Wouldn't surprise you at all. But again, you can note the outlier there. What's going on? Obviously, something's going on. It is very important that we continue this trend, and we do have some choices about whether that trend is going to end on the high end of an envelope or the low end of an envelope. Hating humanity is not the way to a lower population. Turbocharge some of these interventions with a focus on particularly women's health and children's health and accelerate economic development, and we are more likely to land at the bottom end of this envelope by about mid-century rather than the top end, and that will have a material difference on our environmental challenges. So it's worth doing. And fortunately, it's predominantly things that are loving for our fellow humans that help us get there.
There were some Eskimos, Inuits, and they dried their fish and plaited the leather and hunted the polar bears and lived in their igloos. And then they got electricity and their life was destroyed. That's what I'm talking about. I was in China in '88. There wasn't a single car. There were millions of bicycles. There was one tall building in Beijing. And I said, if China goes the way of America and they all get refrigerators and cars, we've had it.
Loving humanity is the way to a lower population. Bringing these people opportunity and health is the way to a lower population. Once they have that, everyone very readily chooses a smaller family. It's a remarkably strong phenomenon. And so again, we need to change that envelope in that part of the world if we are to bring down the global average. And that is really hugely correlated with energy.
Well, Mozart and Shakespeare wrote by candlelight.
Don't forget, Mozart wrote by candlelight.
Everything else you do is unimportant, except to close down all the reactors and to make the governments put solar panels on every single building in America, in Europe, in England, in Australia, in Russia, all over the world, and just cover the place with windmills. It's what we've got to do if we want to keep using electricity. Otherwise, we have to stop using electricity. And think about it, Mozart wrote by candlelight and so did Shakespeare, so the human race has lived for a very long time without electricity.
Economic development and growth and the human development indices, the correlation with per capita energy consumption is undeniable. Unless we bring energy to people, they are existing in a state of semi-subsistence and semi-survival, and we can't expect too much more of them. I occasionally use firewood. It's called camping. It's a little holiday I take for a couple of days, and it's fun and I feel refreshed at the end of it, but it's hard work and I don't have time for a lot more than gathering the fuel to keep me warm at night and do some cooking. That's the way a lot of people in the world, believe it or not, are still living. What does this energy use mean for the rest of nature? For that, I'm just going to move from the breeding of humans to the breeding of animals. My great-grandmother was, for all the nuclear people in the room, she was an early generation fast breeder. It's good. Some rooms that one falls dead flat. Other animals also breed very quickly. General rule of thumb, smaller the critter, faster the breeder. Vinegar flies are really fast. Rats and rabbits are really fast. Bigger the animal, slower the breeder. Large mammals, elephants, and of course whales. Now, for a really, really long time, virtually everyone in the world was hunting whales. There was no particular moral distinction between Australians, Norwegians, Japanese, and Americans, and people in the Middle East. We were all hunting whales like crazy because they were a crucial part of our economy. So the oil from whales was incredibly, incredibly valuable. One of the predominant uses was oil for lamps, for lighting and heating. Now here is a cartoon from Vanity Fair in about 1896. It's called A Whale of a Time. And you have your sperm whales in tuxedos and ball gowns celebrating the discovery of mineral oil in Pennsylvania. It's legit. It's legit. So a satirical cartoonist in the late 19th century understood that the discovery of fossil fuels was going to help save whales. And the cartoonist was right. So the first step to saving whales is having a substitute for what whales were giving us. Okay, it's much easier to love something when you don't need to kill it to survive. What you have there is a rebound effect. Then the use of fossil fuels allows us to power our ships to go out further into the ocean and hunt more whales, okay, for more purposes for whale oil. Whale oil was going into everything. It was in lipstick. And so we needed more substitution to come in, and that's the phenomenon we're talking about here. Hydrogenated vegetable oils were the next crucial substitute for whale oil. So this was an absolute slaughterhouse in the 20th century. By the time we got around to banning whaling in around 1989, hardly anybody was whaling anymore. It was nearly done. A sort of social, environmental, political campaign was the death knell, but it was nearly over, mainly because of the process of substitution. We didn't need to do it very much anymore. Now, this is a really crucially important point. Normally, the great steps forward we take, they get legislated late in the piece. The substitutes need to be quite ready already, and then the legislation is possible. Political will where there's no substitute is hard to come by. Okay, if there's a really good ready substitute in the wings, easy to come by. That's been a huge part of the problem of trying to legislate against carbon emissions. Right? Unless we've got a really sensible, reliable substitute, it's a shit fight every time because we don't really quite know how we're going to do it. Now, fortunately, we have seen that it can succeed. And here are two cases where substitution, as much or more than legislation, was the driving force of these environmental wins. With the ozone hole, substitutes were available. Then there was a massively successful political process to ban CFCs. Yes, indeed, and it should be applauded for that. But we needed the substitutes in place, and now we are seeing distinct recovery of the ozone hole. Whales also bouncing back incredibly well. Some species more than others, though, it has to be said. So southern rights are doing fabulously well. Antarctic blue whale, really slow to recover. A good population of blue whales is a few hundred in the North Atlantic. Okay, so they're really still on the edge. Between the largest animal in the world here takes an awfully long time to breed, and they're only coming back very, very slowly. Now, of course, they feed on krill, which is a carbonaceous life form in the ocean, and krill will be the first against the wall if the ocean becomes too acidic by sucking in too much carbon dioxide. So we're going to need to save the whales again. So the next challenge we have to do is lower carbon emissions. It's one of those big challenges. So what does nuclear energy offer in this picture? So much, so much. It is that substitute, fundamentally. It's the only fuel-based energy source we've ever had that does not burn. So while we may talk about burning nuclear fuel, we're saying that euphemistically. It is not burning. It is not combustion. Okay, it is not rapidly oxidizing to release energy. It's fission. It's an entirely different process. So it's a controlled release of energy that's entirely portable. So often when people talk about 100% renewable energy systems, they mean in part moving to the absence of fuel, the near absence of a fuel-based energy system, and just running instantaneously on what's available from the ambient environment. That would be a remarkable achievement. And nearly none of them can do it. They always need to include some production of hydrogen, biomass, synfuels from surplus renewable electricity. Fuel is vital. So this is a dramatically different type of fuel. We're used to seeing human potential improve as we access fuels of greater power density. Dry firewood to charcoal, to coal, to oil, to natural gas. All has a rising power density. They're better and better, higher quality fuels. We're talking about going from about 20 gigajoules per tonne of dry firewood to 50 gigajoules per tonne of natural gas. So it's a dramatic improvement. But that pellet has 24,000 gigajoules per tonne. That's the difference of uranium. I think it's one reason why nuclear power, the magic of it, it's hard for it to take hold because it is such a step forward in energy. It's a little hard to grasp. We're talking about so much available energy from such a small amount of material. It's quite remarkable. And as it is, that figure I gave you is only using today's very inefficient form of nuclear reactors, believe it or not. So it provides that substitute. It's fuel, it's totally portable, it can be built and operated anywhere, it provides full reliability. It's coal but not coal, basically. It's coal but not coal. So if you want what's good about coal and not the thing that's bad about coal, terrific. Now most of us should want what's good about coal. It's been affordable, it's provided us with plentiful energy, it has powered a massive amount of human progress over the last couple of 100 years, but it is a technology of the 1700s. Even 1600s, and it's time to do better. We have better. A lot of people aren't anywhere near that in the world yet today. A lot of people are still burning charcoal. This is not good for the natural environment. These people are taking local forest to survive. Firewood, similarly, is still a crucial part. Now, these people aren't having debates about how they get their electricity yet and is it affordable. Right? Electricity has yet to come. So there is a huge amount of energy consumption per capita still to be achieved worldwide. And if it is not to be coal, then it needs to be nuclear. Some of these local uses for electricity, absolutely. An off-grid solar panel system could be a tremendous improvement in a very short term, standard of living and an opportunity for people there, and that's great. I would observe that often that narrative comes with an image of a child studying under a lamp, getting their homework done. We've brought a solar system with a small battery and now they can study at night. And that is good. The next question we need to ask is, what will that educated child do in 5 years? Will they have a job? Or will they just be well educated and frustrated, still living in a subsistence economy? That's a very important difference between what those off-grid renewable technologies can offer and what industrialisation with clean energy provides. It's incredibly dangerous if you're not using nuclear power. Indoor air pollution and outdoor air pollution is one of the greatest killers in the world today, worldwide. Particularly in these settings, it's really, really lethal. The suggestion that nuclear radiation is dangerous, well, it's certainly hazardous if you get yourself into a really, really silly situation. But again, returning to camping, I mean, if I sit on the wrong side of the fire for a while, it's not very nice. And it's not. In fact, it's deadly.
As our first witness, we welcome Dr. Helen Quartercup.
Just interested to understand what you regard as the credible sources of information. What do you say others?
I don't regard the IAEA as credible.
The government is lying to you. More people have died from Chernobyl than in the Black Plague.
The biggest medical conspiracy and cover-up in the history of medicine, George.
What do you think is the motivation for the United Nations to perpetuate such an appalling cover-up?
I don't know. I'm not privy to their motivations.
How did you become so interested in nuclear power?
Well, when I was about 16, I read a book called On the Beach, and I lived in Melbourne, which is where the book was set.
Right.
So there's a nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere which could occur tonight. And we all survived, but no one else did because we're so far south. And gradually the radiation came down. And then the government dispensed cyanide capsules to kill the babies. And the beautiful, elegant streets of Melbourne were still there, with St George slaying the dragon outside the public library, and a blind was gently flapping in the breeze.
There'll be no more blossom trees or tulips. There'll be no more babies. There'll be no more Mozart.
And that was the end of life on Earth. I lost my virginity then. I never trusted anyone again.
When Helen speaks, many people make contributions large and small to the organization.
The last 2 chapters of this book are very exciting because they give you the prescription for survival.
$5, $25, $100,000 to support Helen and the work that she does of ending the nuclear age.
I'm testifying at your Darlington hearing soon. What am I going to say? You're all fools. I can't understand why the AMA, American Medical Association, the American Cancer Association, isn't saying close down the reactors.
The Energy-Related Severe Accident Database looks at every accident across the whole energy chain of different energy sources, and it gives a clear finding. Nuclear is safer than coal, safer than oil, safer than gas, and safer than hydropower by a long margin. Major actuarial studies give the same finding. Say what you like about actuaries, they're pretty unemotional in the way they do their work. Nuclear power is the safest major energy source in the world. This has been repeatedly assessed and demonstrated.
Blocking out, before we've even been able to discuss it, a whole suite of technologies which could be extremely useful to us. It seems to me that for the maximum possible rollout of renewables, my aim is fastest, cheapest possible means of preventing runaway climate change. What are we trying to achieve here?
George Monbiot published our email exchanges on The Guardian. How dare he? So stupid. That revolting little man said after Fukushima he's become pro-nuclear. He's either got a cerebral tumour or he's had a psychotic breakdown. That's my clinical diagnosis. Is he being paid? I do wonder. Something fishy's going on. We are dealing with diabolical energy. E equals mc squared. It's the energy that blows up nuclear bombs. It's really all about weapons. Blowing up the world. That's what it's about. And it's the same, it's E equals mc squared. The power is enormous. There's some sort of psychotic element in the nuclear industry. It really does have to do with testosterone and hormone receptors in the brain and behaviour, and sex comes into it. E equals mc squared is a substitute probably for male erection and ejaculation. And they like it, and it's this sort of energy that really grabs them.
A development like this in China, for example, 4 nuclear power plants in a row, built on time and on budget, is going to provide an absolutely massive quantity of electricity that is reliable, affordable and clean to a country that has shifted an enormous number of people from poverty over the last generation. Most of that growth happened on the back of coal, and that's largely why we're in such a dire situation with climate change right now. If nuclear had been ready to power China, we'd be having a really different conversation, and that's largely the fault of the West. Because the US and the EU got scared, stopped building nuclear, stopped making it cheap, and so when China was ready to industrialise, they went with coal. And emissions globally went through the roof because they became a new America in the space of 10 or 12 years in terms of their energy and their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, fortunately, they're taking on nuclear very, very hard. They've just declared 8 new units and they're getting ready to export, which is good news for Australia because that's another competitive player that might sell us affordable nuclear power. So there are really huge environmental and human development imperatives for using nuclear power. People congregate in cities. Cities are enormous bringers of opportunity for people. And so how do we power our cities sustainably? Hopefully with something that takes up not very much room, that can provide a lot of energy really close to the load and really close to the demand. These again are good trends for the environment. If we want a world where we can have and enjoy wilderness and wild creatures and wild spaces and wild animals, we should leave it alone, which is much the life I lead now. I live very, very happily in a city, and then I go and seek wild places when I need them and cherish them when I find them. But I don't live with them, and people in those circumstances will tell you, we hate lions. They eat us, right? They are dangerous, they make us afraid, and we hate elephants. They're destroying our crops, and we can't afford to lose one. Once you're in a position of personal human security, you can cherish these animals. It's very hard to cherish them when they're going to kill you or destroy your livelihood. We were the same. We were exactly the same. Shooting dingoes, still are the same, shooting dingoes.
The townships come up with their own economies and their own ideas. And the man who started this bar, he did it illegally, but now it's licensed. And I can tell you, it's a happening place. This is a lot of fun.
Most people begin their life in cities in places like this, these informal settlements that begin on the edges of cities. The idea that we aren't going to need these dense, high volume energy sources close to cities is fallacious. We really, really are. Now, this looks terrible for us, and I've walked in places like this, and in many ways it is. In other ways, at ground level, you find there's enormous enterprise, opportunity, courage, and over time these sort of settlements tend to formalise, and these people are going to need to move onto the grid. And as they are, they're moving out of natural spaces and we're coming together in cities. And they will do whatever they can to get power. So in the choice between dirty energy, dangerous energy and no energy, dirty and dangerous wins every time. Because no energy is death. So, will we hook up one more connection? Sure. Why not? What could go wrong? But you see this all over the world. People steal it. We need to get them to a place where they can afford it, some sort of affordable electricity plan, get them into the formal economy, and then we can move to safer circumstances for them. More broadly, environmentally, what does it mean? There's a lot of talk at the moment in Australia, and it's about time, about waste. The fact that China has just decided to stop accepting the world's plastic. Recycling and doing it properly is an energy-intensive enterprise. So if we want to recycle materials, and we do, for the sake of the environment, we need energy. If the energy is carbon-based, then environmentally, we're in a paradox. We want to do something better for the environment, but the process of doing it is worse for the environment. Nuclear power, nuclear fission breaks the paradox. We can have as much energy as we want, actually, and then deploy it in a range of incredibly beneficial uses like recycling metals, recycling paper, recycling plastic. There are literally mountains of resources all over the world. The availability of energy that is clean changes everything. A huge part of environmentalism that I was raised on is taught on the idea of scarcity, that there is never enough and so everything is a competition, and that really informs the environmentalist worldview.
This is a 200-ton electric arc furnace. The main power source for the furnace is electricity. And so each furnace at max power is about 105 megawatts. We load scrap into large haul trucks and they back up into this bucket and dump scrap inside.
That's dozens of cars.
Yeah, a lot of cars. So that bucket probably has 140 tons of scrap in it right now. We also use pig iron from a blast furnace, appliances, we chop up old rail cars, demolish bridges, buildings, whatever.
I told them if they thought anything on Putin to run behind you.
Yeah.
That's still the standard protocol.
That's right. I got Kevlar on.
All right, you guys do the same. We're all getting behind you.
So besides your scrap material input, what's your next largest cost on production?
Electricity.
Electricity.
In fact, one of the things that we've been chasing is, in theory, back of the napkin kind of stuff, maybe we could recover another 20 or 30 megawatts out of the 200 we're sharing between these two furnaces. So as we probably captured 90% of what's to be captured, most people don't understand. Everything you look at, touch, feel, anything that's tangible, there's energy behind it, a lot of it.
But you can get far more cycles on recycling steel or aluminum than you could out of paper or plastic.
Oh, sure. Yeah, actually, it's debatable whether paper recycling is even that great a pursuit. In some cases, it's mandated, but this is one where economics drives the recycling.
But the steel industry is probably one of the better models of recycling.
Aluminum, too, would be. There's less given over to waste.
If we could make energy cheap enough, there's a lot of other products you could make economic to recycle.
Absolutely.
Steel industry is probably one of the better models of recycling.
Aluminum, too, would be. There's less given over to waste.
To smelt aluminum or to make aluminum, it requires huge amounts of energy. We've got to stop using aluminium cans. That's just crazy. And all this frozen food is just obscene too. We shouldn't be freezing food. When I was a kid, there was no frozen food. We did all right. You know, in the winter, it's so hot inside, you have to strip. The thermostat should be lowered. Why don't you hang your clothes outside in the sun to dry using the nuclear reactor in the sky? Every time you walk into one of those doors and it goes in front of you, that's powered by electricity.
On a finite planet, there is no sustainable growth. And we're going to run out of everything soon, but in the process, we're going to kill ourselves. Not just ourselves, but 30 million other species that cohabit the planet with us.
Energy scarcity is a huge foundation of that, and it very much informs the environmentalist worldview in terms of how we can solve these problems. When suddenly you discover energy isn't scarce, we're only choosing to make it scarce. And when you suddenly discover that we can have as much clean energy as we want to have, suddenly everything changes. You realise that we can power agriculture and make our agriculture denser and closer and more productive. And if you want wild spaces, agriculture is what takes up the vast majority of our impact on the earth, food production. And when we make it denser, marginal lands on things like hillsides and slopes are the first to go back to nature. This farm is now more productive, we're getting the food we need, that one just goes fallow. So that's the same photograph in the same location. It's reverted farmland. Agriculture in Australia is phenomenally productive. Agriculture in the United States is phenomenally productive. And you can see the trend in that increase in productivity. This is in New England in the United States. Some places just don't need them anymore to grow food. If we want to, we're just getting started on that process. It all comes back to energy. It's the universal substitute. With energy and human ingenuity and ideas, we can do nearly anything when we bring them together, provided the energy source we're using is clean and plentiful and affordable. That's the promise that nuclear power offers, and that's why it's so important that Australia removes this prohibition so that we can open ourselves to the potential and the possibilities of nuclear technology. Thank you very much.